It's often survivors who are the ones who go to remarkable lengths to try to document and preserve their history and tell the story. And it's extremely traumatic for them to do as well. In the context of the Holocaust, it took many people decades to talk about what happened to them. In some cases, like my own grandfather, he could not talk about what happened. It was just too difficult, too traumatic. He lost too many people. And when we think about contemporary genocide today, we see a lot of the same pain, trauma, but also the enormous burden that's on people's shoulders today.
Thank you, Ms. Kickler, for taking your time to do this interview with us. First, I want to start with some of the basics. Can you talk about why you wanted to do this project in the first place and how much resource went into it?
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We felt that it was really important to focus on the plight of the Uyghurs because the scale of the crimes that were reportedly being committed against that community were so large and so severe that for an institution like ours that focuses on genocide and related crimes against humanity, we felt that it was imperative that we start analyzing it, identify what the crimes were that are occurring, help articulate what the risks are to the community, and help elevate the voices of the Uyghur community and put a spotlight on their dire human rights situation. We started working on the situation facing the Uyghurs over 2 years ago. We were very alarmed by the reports of large-scale mass incarceration, very concerned about the reports that the Uyghur community was being persecuted, cultural sites were being destroyed, religious sites destroyed, and very worrying reports around specific attacks on, in particular, Uyghur women and their reproductive capacity. So for 2 years, we have been working, studying, researching the available information that exists and working on the report that was released, while also undertaking other work privately to help advance the level of attention and policy understanding about what is happening to the Uyghur people. So as a center, we look at situations where we think that communities are being persecuted and targeted on the basis of their identity, usually looking at religious identity, ethnic identity, national identity. So we have looked at situations such as the Rohingya community in Burma, the Yazidi and other Iraqi minorities in Iraq who are targeted by the Islamic State. We've done similar analyses and legal analysis to try to understand the crimes that were being committed against those communities. And we do that work because as an institution, we feel that it's incredibly important for the international community to heed the lessons of the past, the lessons of the failures to prevent the Holocaust in which Europe's Jewish community was targeted and persecuted. We often say that our mandate is to try to do for communities today what was not done for Jews during the Holocaust.
I noticed that the report said it was based on public information in the English language. So I'm wondering why English language only?
That's a great question. We wanted to be able to help tackle some of the allegations that exist that there is not sufficient information about the nature of the crimes that are actually occurring. And when you look at what is available and you look at what's available for foreign governments to be able to reach similar conclusions, despite the efforts that the Chinese government has taken and the really extensive efforts that they have done to try to block access to Xinjiang for independent monitors, for investigations, there is considerable information that is available. And so for us, we wanted to be able to show that even with that information that had been translated into English, and in those cases we used the translation that was done by the researchers who had undertaken the initial work and found those sources, that one could reach this conclusion or the conclusions that we drew in our report. Often perpetrators will go to great lengths to try to deny the nature of their crimes or prevent information from getting out. And in this particular case, there is a lot of information, and there is sufficient information in our minds that it should really raise alarm bells for people around the world about what might be happening in Xinjiang. Every government commits to prevent genocide and to punish perpetrators. And also in adhering to the responsibility to protect. The commitment, again, made by states is to protect their own people from crimes against humanity and genocide. So we have clear international articulations of a duty to prevent, a commitment to prevent. What that means is to really ensure that you are not creating or contributing to conditions in which genocide may occur. And given what we've outlined in the report and the concerns that we have, we believe that the Chinese government is failing in that regard at this particular moment. There are steps that they can take, immediate steps that they can take to rectify that. But unfortunately, we have not at this point seen them do that. So the Genocide Convention doesn't articulate specifically what the actual prevention obligations are, but in a situation where we believe that there are clear warning signs that genocide may be occurring and ongoing risks, we feel that there's been a breach then of that duty.
You talked about the Holocaust in your previous answers, so I'm just curious, how would you compare what's happening in Xinjiang right now to what happened back in the 1940s?
So we as an institution never draw direct comparisons between the Holocaust and any situation that's occurring, or between contemporary situations and each other. Each is unique. The commission of these crimes can look very different in different contexts, and out of respect for the survivors and the victims, both past and present, we don't make those types of comparisons. One thing that I think is important to note, though, when we think about where there might be common inflection points, it is the failure to act. It is the reality that there are clear warning signs. There were warning signs in the context of the Holocaust, where you saw a community that was increasingly dehumanized. You saw a community in which their rights and liberties were slowly taken away from them. In the context of Xinjiang, as our report talks about, similarly, the weaker community have had their rights infringed on. We believe that there are warning signs, and what we are urging people to do is to heed those lessons from the past and not make similar mistakes in terms of not acting to actually help protect vulnerable communities.
Would you call this genocide? Because we know that a lot of governments around the world, including the US government, have labeled it genocide. What do you think?
I think what's really important to acknowledge is once we've reached the point in which one can make a determination and say that genocide has occurred, sadly that means that horrific crimes have already taken place. And it means that we as an international community have failed. It's really important that the United States and other governments have acknowledged the crimes that are occurring and have put a name to it. They have access to certain information, including additional intelligence information that we don't. As I said before, we're relying on publicly available information. And so from our perspective, it was important as we look again at that difficult question of genocidal intent, that we stay as rigorous and careful as we could, and therefore express our very, very grave concern that genocide may be occurring. So we, as the US government and as other governments have said, are extremely concerned about what is taking place.
And how much faith do you have that the international community is going to step up and take more actions to stop this from happening?
This is, as we say in the report, unfortunately a very challenging situation. And I think it's really important that we ensure that concerns about human rights, concerns about these crimes are front and center in broader conversations around what the policy response should be vis-a-vis China more broadly. The response needs to be an international one, working through multilateral institutions. We've now seen, for quite a long time, calls for something even as basic as an international investigation, allowing independent monitors to go and do fact-finding in Xinjiang, to learn about what is actually happening. If, as the Chinese government asserts, these crimes are not taking place, then why continue to prevent independent monitors from being able to actually go and assess that for themselves? There are steps that can be taken. People can be released. There could be due process enacted for those who are being detained. In terms of faith that this will happen, I think we have to always remain optimistic that change is possible. especially in a situation where there is such dire suffering.
Why do you think that the rest of China should pay more attention to what's happening in Xinjiang when the rest of the Han or the Chinese population can say, well, what's been done to them might not be done to us since we are the quote-unquote innocent ones?
It's a really important question, and it's also a really challenging question. If we look at the context even of the Holocaust, genocide happened within an environment and in some societies where you had neighbor even turn on neighbor. You had a gradual process of trying to dehumanize people, to say that people were foreigners, to say that they were threats. You saw an effort to try to even vilify women, for example, in the context of the Holocaust, when we talk about Jews and Jewish women as well. And over time, that helped to create a mental sense of distance between people who actually, in many ways, shared a lot in common, and who were all, if we think about Germany or Poland, they were all Germans, they were all Poles. And in the context of China, where there are many different communities that exist, all within the broader umbrella of being Chinese and of China and part of China, it is really important to ensure that on a societal level, we're not fostering divisions and discrimination, and that we also recognize that some of the crimes that can be perpetrated, be it against the weaker community, could be perpetrated against others. One of the things that's important that we talk about in our report, and when we talk about what's happened to women, is around the use of forced IUDs and forced sterilization. Those are practices that have been perpetrated against Han women for decades, against all women in China. That is a crime that has impacted an unbelievably large number of people. And so there is, in some of the aspects of what is happening today to the weaker community, I think to a degree some shared and common experiences. And our hope is that a sense of common humanity would prevail, and that just as in the context of the Holocaust, where Jews were labeled as threats and foreigners and things along those lines, that there are efforts to counter those narratives and efforts to remind people that the actions of the few, if there are, for example, incidents of terrorism, as we talk about in the report, that cannot cast an entire people then in that light. And we have to constantly be pushing back on efforts to try to take away individual identity, an individual's right to basic human dignity, human rights and respect. So when we talk about contemporary atrocities, in some cases we see a similar type of phenomenon and effort undertaken to dehumanize a people and create a justification or a narrative, an us versus them. And in its most extreme, what that helps pave the way for is for actions that allow for mass imprisonment, in some cases, as we saw in the Holocaust, mass killing.